never dawned on me, obviously. I feel like I have some divine intervention that helps me select these books, that we would be in the middle of cocaine, death squads, and the war on terror when we're taking out drug traffickers um, in Latin America, Caribbean area as we're doing this book. So, um, surprise! It does seem to work that way. In just about every book that we've done, there is something that happens that makes the material that we're covering even more relevant. So, Renee, I'm going to throw you up as a co host until Bridget gets here in case we lose the space, which normally happens, if you don't mind. And that way we are not at risk of losing the space. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Where we left off um, was the in depth look at the FARC and what it was really all about. So, um, I just threw it to you again, Renee. Um, and that leads us into, and we talked just briefly about it. Um, I don't know if it's not letting you get it. Hold on just a second. I'm going to try to get Renee up here. All right. I got you as a speaker.
For some reason, it's not letting me do it. I don't know why.
Okay. I just tried it one more time. I brought you up as a speaker, and then I'll throw you the co-host and see if it works that time.
Cool.
Okay. So anyway, where we left off was we had mentioned Plan Colombia, and basically chapter 6 is about Plan Colombia. So that's where we're headed. In 2000, President Bill Clinton authorized Plan Colombia. It was a $1.3 billion U.S. aid package for the quote unquote war on drugs, which included military assistance, including helicopters, planes, and training, a massive chemical and biological warfare effort, and electronic surveillance technology. You know, everything that you could possibly need if you're setting up a drug network. So we're literally giving Colombia, the narco capital of Latin America, all of the machinery to grow their narco trafficking. And by this time, we've made it perfectly clear that the United States government knows that the Colombian government are in bed and protecting the narco state. So we just, in 2000, give them $1.3 billion of taxpayer money to grow the narco state. The total budget would eventually be $7.5 billion that U.S. Americans paid the Colombian government to grow their narco state. So, even the European Union contributed $2.2 billion. So about $10 billion total. The original version of Plan Colombia was initiated by the then president Pastrana, who argued that the drug crops are a special problem whose solution must pass through the solution to the armed conflict, you know, because we're going to use the FARC as the reason why they're growing their narco state. Developed countries should help us to implement some sort of a quote unquote Marshall Plan for Colombia. And of course, we know the Marshall Plan is what created Operation Gladio, stay behind units in Europe. That's why it's important that you know your history. As soon as they start talking about the Marshall Plan, you know exactly what they're going to do. He argued that it would allow them to develop investments in the social field in order to offer our peasants different alternatives than to grow coca leaves. Of course, none of that money ever made it to the local peasants. Pastrana's Plan Colombia did not focus on drug trafficking, military aid, or fumigation, but instead advocated the manual eradication of drug crops. Somehow that never happened, though, despite having $10 billion to do it. Under pressure by the Clinton administration, supposedly, Pastrana saw that it was necessary to create an official document that specifically served to convene important U.S. aid, as well as that of other countries and international organizations, by adequately addressing the quote unquote concerns, which were principally focused on the FARC insurgency. Again, the boogeyman. As a result, the first formal draft of the Plan Colombia was written in English. The Spanish version became available months later. They were writing it for us. The Clinton version of the Plan Colombia focused on drug trafficking and the strengthening of the Colombian military. And it wasn't anti trafficking, it was just drug trafficking. And growing the military in order to be able to protect the drug crop, not to eradicate it. Former U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, Robert White, stated, quote, "If you feel the original Plan Colombia, not the one that was written in Washington, but the original Plan Colombia, there's no mention of military drives against the FARC rebels. Quite the contrary. President Pastrana says the FARC is part of the history of Colombia and a historical phenomenon. He says, and they must be treated as Colombians. Colombia comes and asks for bread, and you Americans give us stones," unquote. So, another way of looking at that is the U.S. is insisting upon the fact that you have a boogeyman. We're not going to spend $10 billion unless we can blame someone for the increase, which is exactly what happened, in the drug trafficking. We have to have a boogeyman. Under the legal banner and drug policies of the Colombian Plan, Clinton militarized the nation and financed the counterinsurgency with the political support of George Soros's organization, Human Rights Watch. In 2001, President George W. Bush added $550 million, renaming it the Adrian Initiative. Between 1996 and 2001, U.S. military aid to Colombia increased 15-fold from $68 million to $1 billion. During the same period, raw coca cultivation grew 150%, from 67,000 to 170,000 hectares. And each one of those is 2,000 acres, over 2,000, like 2.5 acres, 2,500 acres. So that's a crap load of land. The leaked Colombian government document of 2001 estimated that Colombia produced 800 to 900 tons of cocaine annually, not the 580 tons announced by the U.S. State Department and DEA. So, nearly double, and our State Department lied to us. Big shocker. In 2004, President Uribe and the Bush administration negotiated an extension to Plan Colombia, named Plan Colombia 2, which was to last until 2009. During the negotiations, President Uribe extolled the advances achieved on the war on drugs and the war on terror, and asserted that the U.S. capital injected into Colombia had succeeded in making them a safer country. Safer for the elite, and no reduction in drugs. We literally doubled it. The Plan Colombia has been maintained as an ongoing military program by successive White House administrations that aim to assist the Colombian state to end the cocaine trade. But somehow it just keeps growing. Since 2000, U.S. military aid and training to Colombia has totaled over $6.8 billion. And that's completely separate than the Plan Colombia money. Initially, there had been an organized resistance mounted against President Clinton's Plan Colombia by international advocates, which resulted in limiting the number of U.S. troops and privately contracted forces, those private military companies, to 800, 400 U.S. personnel and 400 contracted personnel. Despite this, Colombia cocaine remained a major illicit export, and the FARC insurgency had not been brought to an end. After the terrorist attacks on 9/11, George W. Bush and Colombian President Pastrana intensified the armed campaign against the FARC insurgents' support base within the context of the global war on terror. Because now they're not just drug agents, the FARC, they're now terrorists. In 2003, Bush and the Colombian president Uribe launched an all-out offensive named Plan Patriot, which imposed Uribe's democratic security measures, viewed by some as a state-sponsored terrorist campaign. In other words, he basically declared martial law. In October 2002, reports were leaked indicating that U.S. Special Forces teams were on orders to eliminate all high-ranking officers of the FARC and scattering those who escaped to the remote corners of the Amazon. But the operation failed to force the FARC into strategic retreat. During Uribe's presidency, coca production continued to increase, and throughout the whole Crystal Triangle, which was kind of the purpose, actually, which again provides a flush of cash into the United States. Plan Colombia ushered in an era of mega projects, massive U.S. and international investment to capital-intensive infrastructure such as pipelines for the oil companies, highways for the mining companies, and dams to exploit the country's natural resources, including the oil and coal. So in other words, you and me are paying the oligarchs in the United States to build roads and buy land in Colombia to make them rich. We get no return on our investment. In the countryside, land was cleared and oil, wood, water, and cash crops extracted. Communities that had neighborhood beaches lost to them to U.S. oligarchs' installation of large hotels. In major cities, a desperate, repressed, and impoverished working class and peasantry were forced to live on starvation wages without protection or services. Liberal legislation enacted by President Uribe, specifically Law 71 in 1988, which privatized pension funds, and guess who bought them all? Law 50 of 1990, which dismantled labor laws and protections for workers' rights, and guess who that benefited? The oligarchs. Law 100 of 1993, which privatized health care and Social Security. In other words, the U.S. oligarchs were down there now running their health care and their Social Security investments. Subsequently, in centers of cocoa crop production, as much as 50% of Colombia's workforce were employed in the cocaine industry by by the year 2002. So much for Plan Colombia. Anti drug trafficking. It was described in Fortune magazine in 1988 that the cocaine industry was probably the fastest growing and unquestionably the most profitable industry in the world. As Plan Colombia targeted the FARC, the narco elite concentrated within the cities of Medellin, Cali, Bogota, were protected by the Colombian state. President Uribe supported the introduction of the IMF, because of course they've got to have their piece, structural adjustment programs, privatization, i.e., exploitation, and Colombia's membership in the free trade area of Americas, thereby strengthening their narco economy. Colombia's narco economy has affected the nation in terms of savings, inflation, and employment. In 2002, public debt was close to 54% of the gross national product. But the threat of an Argentinian style collapse was warded off by the strength of the cocaine. A 2002 UN report estimated that the average wholesale price of cocaine for the new millennium per kilogram was in the US $20,000. In Europe, it was as high as $38,000. At retail per gram in the US, it was $80 and $70 in Europe. These are the average prices. Obviously, because cocaine can be cut and sugar added or whatever, they vary wildly inside the United States. The U.S. invests money in oil-rich countries for the purpose of exporting uninterrupted supplies of oil. The investment covers the cost of drilling, refinery, distributing, servicing, and securing oil fields and pipelines. In areas of anti-imperialist resistance, such as Afghanistan and Iraq, estimates for the total U.S. cost of protecting and securing oil reserves has reached a staggering $3.7 trillion. But that's all easily undone if you go to war in those countries. However, the U.S. does not invest money in drug-rich countries for the purpose of exporting drugs. The cocaine business is for the shadows of the underworld, not daily market reports, alongside stocks and commodities. The U.S. benefits from it nonetheless because most of the profits in the cocaine trade are invested in the U.S., not in Colombia, which of course is how we learned that if you don't do that, you get yourself killed. It is difficult to precisely calculate the value of Colombian cocaine revenues, which, according to one study, makes the task of estimating its real value to the Colombian economy impossible. Further, as the illegal business, the apparent secrecy of cocaine profits generated by Colombians' narco economy remains its real strength. Conservatively, however, the total revenue for the commercial export of cocaine in the year 2002 was $3.5 billion. That was actually almost the equivalent of what they got in oil. The gross national product in America from those same sales could be as high as $11 billion. Colombia's National Association of Financial Institutes estimated that the nation's total 1999 income from illicit drug trade was $3.5 billion. The estimate was based on an assumption that somewhat less than 10% of the total earnings from illicit drugs are repatriated back to Colombia, which means the rest end up here. Although the figures are based on a 1999 study, on these estimates, it is possible to assume the Colombian drug earnings would be considerably higher today if current production forces and relations are equivalent. One source had estimated that in 2003, They had risen to $52 billion. And that's just from Colombia, folks. This stuff is going on, as we learned, all over. The opium trade, the heroin trade, that doesn't include any of that. That's just Colombia. And of course, we had Peru, and then up to a certain point until Evo Morales came into Bolivia, they also were narco states. The Crystal Triangle. The historical events in Latin America that facilitated the growth of the cocaine trade involved the ascendancy of military and civilian regimes committed to policies that institutionalized cocaine trade. Colombia is one of several. Liberal policies had a profound impact on the Colombian economy and social structure, creating a powerful transnational class of businessmen and investors. One quote said, "The notorious frequency with which the paramilitaries situate themselves where drug dealers are active or where there is mega projects such as hydroelectric dams or new highway pushing up land values indicates that behind paramilitarism there is something other than an altruistic interest in counterinsurgency." In other words, they're basically just using them to protect the oligarchs' investments. To protect and secure its capital in Colombia, the U.S. must promote and protect its agents of economic operations inside of Colombia, paramilitaries and state security forces who are connected to the counterinsurgency campaigns. Further, to secure cocaine for American markets, the narco elite must rely on large sums of U.S. capital for the counterinsurgency effort dedicated to the quote unquote war on drugs and war on terror. They are fleecing us of our taxpayer dollars to set up narco states. Legitimizing spending on arms, equipment, and training to fight this insurgency thus becomes a necessary function of U.S. imperialism. Again, you have to create the boogeyman in order to be able to justify sending the arms. So you're always going to have a boogeyman, even if it's not legitimate. And I'm not saying the FARC wasn't a pain in their ass. They were. And they were not completely innocent. But they did not provide the impetus for us to be spending $10 billion when it's supporting a narco state. Behind the official discourse of fighting drugs and terrorism, there remains an agenda in Colombia that is no longer hidden to secure military victory over the FARC and eliminate obstacles to the mega projects of U.S. oligarchs in Colombia's rich national resources. Automated factories with no need for unskilled labor, many of them multinational, have relocated to state-declared tax-free zones called industrial parks. These developments plunder natural and genetic resources like gold, platinum, silver, manganese, radioactive cobalt, zinc, chrome, nickel, copper, and exotic wood, and large fishing resources. Oil resources in Colombia are as enormous as cocaine. To secure Colombia's resources for American markets, the police, military, and paramilitary forces of the narco military network have carried out U.S.-led counterinsurgency operations, mainly against indigenous people, but also the FARC. It basically establishes a recolonialization process to penetrate Colombia for cocaine exports, and they used the Clintons playing Colombia to do so. It promoted the war on the FARC while it militarily secured coca production facilities for the narco elite. Before the lead up to the global financial crisis in 2007, More coca had been grown in Colombia than at any other time in the nation's history. So the entire time from the 80s, the 90s, now we're into the 2000s, because that's 2008. The cocaine industry just continued to grow. The more billions of dollars of our tax money that went into was literally growing the narco state. Since then, both the UN and the US reported dramatic increases in the cocoa cultivation, but never any overall drop in the amount of cocaine. In other words, they're just lying to us. A strategy to take control of territory strategically valued to economic interests of oligarchs and their partnership in Colombia has been imperative since the cocaine decade in since the cocaine decades. Rebel strongholds of the FARC in Colombia's second largest insurgency, the ELN, contests the counterinsurgency strategy. One displaced activist from the Department of Caco explained in 2001, quote, "It's simply a war about land and resources, and the people living in these lands happen to be in the way," unquote. Happens in every country. Paramilitary militia target not only guerrillas, but also social, labor, popular, and peasant movements that dare to question the development of any oligarch project. Resistance from the FARC would spell further retaliatory action from the narco state. The AUC paramilitary death squads in Colombia are directly linked to the counterinsurgency strategy devised by Washington and the Bogota government to combat quote unquote FARC rebels. However, the AUC is also an important component of the Colombian narco military network. The FARC campaign has seen the Colombian state, backed by Washington, adopt a variety of measures to engage the guerrillas in direct and indirect warfare, and the civilian population has been caught in the crossfire. In Colombia, the most significant decisions made by Bogota in conjunction with Washington have been about what kind of war will be fought, a decision dictated by long range goals, and about what kind of weapons will be used. Before Vietnam, counterinsurgency was a type of warfare devised under Kennedy administration during the Cold War to neutralize insurgencies in the Third World. A principal aspect of counterinsurgency strategy involved the physical separation of the local population from the guerrilla forces through political, military, and economic means. And of course, that's what brought us the Phoenix program, the actual physically burning down of villages, moving the people into controlled smart cities, in this case, villages, and checking IDs in and out of the village so you can control every aspect of their life. That's what they're talking about here. Counterinsurgency doctrine recognized that political and economic and social reform could be the foundation of an effective military strategy. And they're talking literally about creating 15-minute cities here in modern day terminology. Theodore Shackley, one of the most notorious CIA agents of covert operations in Southeast Asia and Latin America, described counterinsurgency strategy as the third option. You know, kind of like our book that we did a long time ago, The Third Way. It required not only cross-agency support and networking, but also recruiting anyone who might prove useful to the military campaign, such as corrupt military officers, right-wing groups. Right-wing is not the proper term. Traitors, professional criminals, and drug traffickers. Because they relied on these paramilitary covert operations to traffic the drugs. According to Doug Valentine, whose book we used on the Phoenix program, the tracking down of Che Guevara by the CIA in 1967 was a classic case of covert intelligence operations using drug trafficking, a Bolivian counter narcotics unit, and the FBN, which later became the DEA. In the 21st century, American counterinsurgency strategies has become more sophisticated due to advancements and innovation in military technology, especially in surveillance and communication. In 2004, President Uribe met with George W. Bush in Washington to ask the U.S. to remove its limit on the number of U.S. service members and contractors in Colombia. Bush agreed to increase the number from 400 U.S. military, mostly special operation forces, and another 400 U.S. private military contractors to 800 and 600, respectively. Thus, presidential decisions changed the way covert operations were being conducted. Late, rather than working closely with the national military network, U.S. covert operations service members and contractors are decentralized and carry out operations with privatized armies, which the U.S. military calls special operation teams. Special teams of land, sea, and air maintain a presence in Colombia and engage in various covert activities. The covert operations are categorized as number one, direct action, two, strategic reconnaissance, three, unconventional warfare, four, foreign internal defense, five, civil affairs, six, psychological operations, seven, counterterrorism, eight, humanitarian assistance, not a lot of that, nine, theater search and rescue, and 10, activities specified by the president or SecDef. Those are assassinations. The principal advisory and assistance unit in Colombia has been the 7th Special Forces Group, subordinate to the control of U.S. Southcom and the U.S. Army's Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg. The military group, which is the in-country military group, is a quote-unquote advisory unit, normally under the control of the U.S. Embassy in Bogota. Southcom coordinates deployments and missions of the U.S.-based units in Latin America. The military group supervises and supports U.S. Army Special Operations Command, provides the forces. Southcom coordinates, and the military group links all of the operations, maintaining liaison with the Colombian military. Former members within the Colombian military command, such as General Uribe, have worked closely with special operations personnel. The CIA contingent in Colombia is based in the U.S. Embassy in Bogota and is in close contact with the U.S. Ambassador, Department of Defense, and National Command Authority. The American Special Operations personnel consisting of Colombian covert operations is top secret. However, the following incident carried the hallmarks of a narco-military network in action. On May 4th, 2001, a bomb exploded outside the Cali cartel El Toro, or El Torre. 20 people were wounded in the incident, but no group claimed responsibility. This was followed a month later by other bombings in in Medellin, Bogota, and a city with a whole bunch of letters in it, close to the University of Columbia, all following the exact same footprint. First, a small bomb explodes and a crowd gathers. Local police, explosive experts, and dog squads arrive. Then a much larger bomb explodes, killing them all. The Colombian media adopted the official version of these events from military sources, which blamed the FARC, of course. Some variation of the story of these bombings were circulated, but there were only limited investigations of any of the events by the government. FARC members were blamed. Special operation teams have also targeted FARC sympathizers and supporters with bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations. These activities have created and maintained a climate of fear among all of the civilian population in Colombia. Those are the political those on the political side of the aisle that supports trade union members are seen as rebels who are in opposition to the Colombian government. Trade unionists have been murdered, along with community activists, human rights campaigners, and church leaders. This form of secret state terror has become almost normalized in Colombia that is geared for a situation of permanent civil war. And of course, destabilization is necessary if you're going to conduct narco operations, as we've learned throughout this study. The counterinsurgency methods deployed in Colombia have been taught, excuse me, since the 1960s at the School of Americas, now called the Western Hemispheric Institute, excuse me, for Security Cooperations at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I told you guys the story that I visited Fort Benning, Georgia, and was met by a Colombian major coming out the door as I was entering the facility. That still just boggles my mind. Special operation agents, including former Green Berets, veterans from covert operations in Central America and the Gulf War, mercenaries, private contractors, and active duty Colombian military have all engaged in guerrilla warfare against their citizens while labeling it as they're operating against the FARC. According to Stan Golf, a senior U.S. Special Forces advisor to Colombia anti-narcotics battalions in 1990s, the involvement of the U.S. in the Colombian conflict is not subject to official oversight. The U.S. role in Colombia is described as a private security and is supported by the active, energetic, and highly sophisticated collaboration of the corporate media. In other words, the CIA-controlled media. And that comes from a guy that was actually involved in it all. A former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs contends that the teams were designed to increase the ability of the Colombian units to turn intelligence into operations to help the Colombian military. And of course, we know the Colombian military is in support of the narco state. As has been done by governments in other regions of conflict, the shatter zones in the third world, like in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, the Colombian government has enforced a law of silence aimed at neutralizing not only resistance to their draconian laws, but also to counter negative perceptions from the public with fear and compliance as a form of low intensity conflict. The CIA terms psychological warfare and psychological operations are defined as, quote, the planned use of propaganda and other psychological actions having the primary purpose of influence opinion, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of quote unquote hostile foreign groups in such a way as to support the achievement of national objectives, unquote. During the cocaine decade, the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy took a new direction to low intensity conflict. Its planners had learned crucial lessons from mistakes in Vietnam, one of which was the recognition of Vietnam syndrome. The American public had been told that the war was winnable when it was not. The consequence was the heavy U.S. casualties would not be tolerated by people in any future conflict. Thus, in subsequent conflicts, a greater focus was placed on the political delegitimization of the enemy, i.e., the FARC. Through the management of public opinion, both nationally and internationally, U.S. planners recognized that low intensity conflict and psychological warfare could be crucial in its management of consent and central to overall victory. Put simply, if popular support for the enemy was destroyed, victory could be achieved through constant perception management combined with military operations and state repression. The preface of a CIA manual prepared for the Nicaraguan Contras reflects this emphasis on the crucial importance of psychology in a conflict. This is an actual quote from that manual. Guerrilla warfare is essentially a political war. And hold on, I got to stop right there. You guys remember what the name of the school is in Taiwan? Taiwan has a huge impact on Latin America. You find Taiwanese people everywhere throughout Latin America. That was a newsflash for me. Their school, like the School of Americas, is called Political Warfare Cadre Academy. It has no more impact than what I'm about to read to you. So I'm going to start the quote over. Guerrilla warfare is essentially a political war. Therefore, its area of operation exceeds the territorial limits of conventional war. To penetrate the political entity itself, the political animal that Aristotle defined, in effect, the human should be considered the primary objective in a political war and conceived as the military target of guerrilla warfare. The human being has his most critical point in his mind. Once his mind has been reached, the political animal has been defeated without necessarily receiving bullets. Guerrilla warfare is born and grown in the political environment, in the constant combat to dominate the area of political mentality that is inherent to all human beings and which collectively constitutes the environment in which guerrilla warfare moves, and which is precisely its victory or failure is defined. This conception of guerrilla warfare as political war turns psychological operations into a decisive factor of the results. The target then is the mind of the population. All the population are troops, the enemy troops, and the civilian population. That should scare the shit out of everybody. That's crazy. From the late 1980s, the Colombian state commenced efforts to manufacture its image as the defender of democracy at war with narco-terrorists, while they were in fact enabling the narco-terrorists. The state employed the services of Sawyer Miller Group. What is Sawyer Miller Group? Oh, it's just a PR company in the United States. They were hired to wage psychological warfare on Colombia's narco-terrorists, the FARC. So, with our tax dollars, we hired a PR firm to go down and basically build out the psychological warfare to create the FARC as the enemy. In the first 6 months of 1991 alone, Sawyer Miller earned almost $1 million in manufacturing a narco-terrorist conspiracy against the FARC. So if the FARC is so bad, why do you need a PR firm to make them bad? David Mazzaros, the director of Sawyer Miller's Colombian account, then explained that the main mission is to educate, not propagandize, educate the American media about Colombia, get good coverage in the media, and nurture contacts with journalists, columnists, and think tanks. The message is that there are bad and good people in Colombia and that the government is the good guy. That's literally a quote. By the early 1990s, Sawyer Miller Group had regularly used American press to disseminate Colombian government propaganda reported as news. With the routine production of pamphlets, letters to editors signed by Colombian officials that they did not create, and advertisements in places like the Washington Post and New York Times, which are CIA mouthpieces. Despite the propaganda about the FARC as narco terrorists, in 2001, Colombian intelligence estimated that the FARC controlled less than 2% of cocaine production. 2%. Again, meaning 98% was under the control of the narco state. That's just crazy. The ideological engineering through the media is consistent with the US crusade in the Cold War against the quote unquote communist. The US war on drugs and terror have drawn Washington and the repressive Colombian regime closer to their campaign to combat the FARC insurgents ideologically and militarily. The consensus created by CIA propaganda views the FARC as narco terrorists, which has accorded the Colombian government basically a free range to do whatever they want. And all of their attacks, regardless of whether they're against the FARC or not, was legitimate. The state's task is made easier in this respect by the involvement of death squads and paramilitary forces and the assistance of professional criminals in carrying out operations against the Colombian population, not the FARC. In the struggle for state power, hegemony is contested in different ways in Colombia. In Puerto Vieja, a paramilitary stronghold along a river, a huge billboard reads, "Welcome to the anti-communist capital of Colombia." Where did they get those terms? Anti-communist. Reminding all visitors of the political significance of ideology in the conflict, because you know the FARC's got to be communist. Members of the Colombian Revolutionary left, meaning the actual rebels, not leftist thinking, must remain anonymous or risk being arrested for subversion. In other words, you can't speak out against the government because they're going to call you a communist. Nevertheless, anti-government political graffiti is visible and criticisms of the Colombian state is evident in anonymous internet blogs and websites. In Colombian news broadcasts, guerrillas and trade unionists are blamed for every disorder that occurs. Colombian media expert Silvio Weisbord stresses that the role of Colombian media is to serve as a political and economic interest rather than to support freedom of expression. In Colombia's 2002 presidential elections, Uribe running mate was Calderon, Francisco Santos Calderon, was from Colombia's most prominent media family and the former editor of the major newspaper. Contrary to media headlines about Uribe's landslide victory, it was the lowest voter turnout in Colombians' history. Just a little bit of details left out. So, one Michael Tunsing argues that creating a political atmosphere of fear and terror sustains the war machine in Colombia. An anonymous Bogota journalist that Tossing interviewed said, "When I wrote anything, I asked myself how Castano, the guy that was running the AUC, is going to react. Most journalists in Colombia are killed for exposing corruption. Human rights experts paid little attention to a prevailing culture of paramilitary terror. Some non governmental organizations in Colombia have offered virtual endorsements of the intervention of the U.S. Human Rights Watch, for example, has effectively legitimized U.S. military aid to Colombia in the war on terror. Billionaire George Soros' organization, Human Rights Watch, is relatively silent on the routine killings of labor leaders and reporters. In April 2002, Human Rights Watch spokesman Jose Varcano testified before the U.S. Senate in favor of Plan Colombia. This is a quote, Colombians remain committed to human rights and democracy. They need help. Human Rights Watch has no fundamental problem with the U.S. providing that help, unquote. Yeah, because it's all about democracy in a military dictatorship or fake elections. In the repressive situation in Colombia, a coerced population is expected to oppose the FARC insurgency and support the Colombian government. On February 7, 2003, Colombia and the U.S. blamed the FARC for a bombing at Club El Nogal in Bogota, which made world headlines. The event exemplified essential features of the psychological warfare in a way that it targeted people's opinion, emotions, attitudes, and behavior to achieve national objectives. The bombing took place in an exclusive venue, high society club. There was tight security at the club. Guards with bomb sniffing dogs searched for explosives prior to the event. Not even the bodyguards of club members were allowed to enter the premises. The Colombian government charged that 3 alleged members of the IRA assisted the FARC, a charge that was later proven false. Accusations and denunciations overrode and replaced evidence regarding the perpetrators of the bombing. Colombia's Vice President Santos asserted, quote, there is absolutely no doubt it was the FARC, unquote. President George W. Bush stated, quote, we stand with the Colombian people in their fight against narco-terrorists who threaten their democratic way of life, unquote. We have no democracy down there. It's all fake. And George Bush, along with Clinton, funded the narco state. They know damn good and well it wasn't the FARC. It was a psychological bombing in order to justify further aid. It's absolutely crazy. What time are we? We're about at the hour. Let me finish this. We'll stop right there so that we can get to the rest of it tomorrow. So, I don't know if there's SR71. Let's bring him up. We had trouble getting people into co-host. Go ahead, Illini.
Hey, Colonel. Good to see you. I don't want to front run, any work that you've got on this, on what you talked about with Alpha Warrior last night, the, 1971 protests outside of the Council on Foreign Relations. But if you've already posted it, I'm curious about how the documents got to you.
I have not posted about it. It's actually the entire transcript is online.
Okay. I think that's pretty interesting. I think, I mean, it's why, if you can prove that those documents were inside of it's that house in New York City, I think. If you can prove that those documents were inside of the CFR's, building in New York City in 1971, and they came out and they've got contemporaneous reporting on it, and somehow they were able to, authenticate it.
Right.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'm still working on that, and what's in there is crazy. And before I made the post, I did want to do due diligence to everything that you just said, which is why I have not made the post yet. I'm still checking it.
Okay.
I have no problem sending you the link if you can help,
sure.
Because it's a crazy discovery.
It's wild. I can give you one piece of context on this, which everybody can find at the Nixon Presidential Library. I'll try to add it to the nest if, while somebody's asking their next question of you. But, Henry Kissinger, got made Secretary of State basically by Rockefeller.
Right.
Rockefeller, had Kissinger, advising on foreign policy during his 1968 campaign.
Yep.
Kissinger winds up becoming the Secretary of State, and then you'll never believe what happens to Kissinger's classified memos, which he submitted, according to the Nixon Library, for declassification requests still in 2003 when he was writing his book. Those memos don't go to the National Archive. They don't stay at the White House. They don't go to the State Department. They don't stay within the federal government. Guess whose personal vault they wind up in from 1976 to 1983?
Whose?
David Rockefeller's. So not Nellie's, David's.
So David Rockefeller has Kissinger's classified documents, who was basically given the job by Nelson Rockefeller.
Yes. So I don't know if David has a security clearance, and this all seems to kind of tie in with that 1980 conference I think you posted about a year ago, or maybe 6 months ago, at Mohonk Mountain House.
Yes.
Where there's two Chase Bank directors meeting with the CIA.
Yes.
And you've got, the published agenda from it, and the question's why is Chase Bank, here? Why is the CIA coming up to upstate New York rather than this meeting being in, at Langley, or somewhere around the DC area? Why are they all coming to New York to be with Chase Bank?
But we know why now, right?
Well, those documents seem to kind of be interesting, and some of the other background that we have seems to give you a little bit of a foundation to start to say, wow.
Well,
maybe there's something to this.
Okay. So it gave me the foundation to say what I have said for the last year, in that the CIA does not work for the United States government. It works for the oligarchs. And you see this over and over again. So so for those of you who didn't watch the Alpha Warrior show, I made a comment at the end that I was working on something that I thought was fairly important, because I had discovered. So for those of you who don't know, the Council on Foreign Relations is an organization that facilitates a lot of the people that I call the International Syndicate to meet on a routine basis. But within the CFR, there has been lots of people write about the fact that they have a secret committee within the council that meets on a routine basis. And supposedly in 1971, a movement kind of barnstormed the building of one of the members and discovered in files a copy that's, because you're not supposed to take notes, you're not supposed to do anything in these meetings where the secret meetings where anything can be exposed. But this person had taken notes of the meeting in which Alan Dulles and Bissell, the guy that was running covert operations at the time, made a whole bunch of statements. And they're kind of wild in what they're talking about. And so, for the first time ever, they had their hands on a document from this secret group within the Council on Foreign Relations. That's what Illini is talking about. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would be meeting with oligarchs and this international syndicate anywhere, because that's literally who they work for. They don't work for us. They deliver results for those people. They've never delivered results for the American people. We don't benefit from any of these government overthrows. They all benefit from them. And again, follow the money. We pay for the CIA, they go overthrow a government, and the oligarchs all get rich over the newly installed, primarily military dictators that we paid to overthrow. Sometimes it's not our money, sometimes it's drug money, but in effect, we paid for that too, because there's a whole bunch of dead bodies from drug overdoses. So no matter which way you look at it, we're paying for this shit. And they're extorting these countries for their natural resources, because as a part of the overthrow, we're buying off the newly installed government to work on the behalf of the international syndicate. And they're using the CIA to do this. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I've pinned the link to the nest from the Nixon Library. So if people are looking for reputable sources to kind of indicate that there might be a little bit more going on here in terms of, the accountability on classified information, they can take a look at, what's on the Nixon Library's website. It's pretty wild if you read the whole thing and look through it. They just say it so plainly and matter-of-factly that, the documents were stored at David Rockefeller's New York estate.
That's
in this
crazy.
Vault. And yeah, the Nixon was in the odds was submitting declassification requests to the Central Intelligence Agency, and you can kind of put two and two together to realize that, therefore, by implication, they were storing these highly classified documents that apparently Kissinger. They also say that I think Kissinger might have modified once or twice when he was writing one of his books. So I just find that fascinating, and it gives you some more foundation.
Well, yes, and thank you for that. And it goes to the whole heart of who the CIA literally works for, as well as Kissinger. And I mean, of course, we find Kissinger at, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It was like the International something something. He established basically a think tank on the Harvard campus that was 100% a CIA front. And it was later discovered that it was 100% a CIA front. And there was a woman that was the deputy administrator of that think tank. And all they did once it was discovered and outed as a CIA think tank is close it down, create another one on the Harvard campus, and put the same woman in charge. So she went from being deputy to Kissinger in a CIA front to in charge of another CIA front. They literally did what they do all the time: close down the outed one, create another one, stick it in the same place, and start it up. But in this case, they were so bold, they used the same woman. SR-71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everyone for attending today. Sorry I'm late. All the 5 people here on Spaces and in Rumble. I did post your link on the Rumble deal, the Lion Eye, so they have a chance to take a look at it as well.
Thank you for doing that,
I
SR71.
did get a chance to listen to you and Alpha Warrior last night, and it blew my mind. Anybody else that hasn't had a chance to listen to it might want to go crazy with it. I did find one thing that struck out at me was the symbolism of the DC flag in some of these games.
Yeah.
Or one of these games.
Yeah, MS-13.
Yes, I'm not sure how Alpha came up with that, but boy, it certainly looks that way to me. Thank you, girl.
Because MS-13 was huge in LA, and he was a gang cop. And so now you take that information. He saw that tattoo on a lot of people that he was involved with out there, because tattoos is one of the ways that you recognize the affiliation of gang members in Los Angeles. And so he was very familiar with that tattoo. And now that he's into his tinfoil hat activities, and somebody flashes up the DC flag, and I talked to him a couple of months ago about it, and he was like, "Holy shit! Do you realize that's the MS-13 gang member sign?" And so, yeah, I'm glad he brought that up last night, because it's huge. Symbolism will be their downfall, I think somebody said. Yeah, I think somebody once said symbolism will be their downfall or something like that. Yeah. Craziness. All right. Well, I don't see any other hands. So we just made it to Savannah, and we are going to go downtown and have dinner and kind of do some exploring. So I know, I don't remember who the gentleman was, but there is somebody that's in Savannah in our audience. And if you hear this, please DM me and remind me who you are, so that while we're here, we could definitely get together for dinner or whatever it is. So anyway, that's it for today. Hopefully, we will be back home on Monday. Monday's a travel day, so chances are we will not be having a space unless I do it later in the evening. But because I don't like to do them while we're traveling, the connections and all. But yeah, so we'll definitely do the one tomorrow, and then we will continue probably Tuesday on our regularly scheduled program. So, again, thank you all for being so patient with us as we've traveled and went around and saw old friends and got to see some of the sights out in real America. Kind of grounded me back again, taking a brief retreat from the constant craziness. But again, just through divine intervention, the fact that we're going through this right now and learning about the real deal, you will be able to understand some of the things that I question. Just like last night on Alpha Warrior show, I do have some real hesitancy in whose intelligence are we using right now. So in the post that I make, you guys, I want you just to make sure you understand. I don't post things to be not supportive of President Trump. You guys know I'm very supportive of him. I'm not supportive of our government. And as we have seen both in today's testimony from RFK Jr., there's still a lot of really bad players inside of our government. So I am going to be very hesitant. Robbie Starbuck, who I absolutely love what he's doing, made a post just before we started the show about, the narco terrorist, they'll cut your hands off, they'll do all of this other stuff. And basically, he was glad they were dead. And I push back on that because, generally speaking, the people in those speedboats are not the bad guys. As a matter of fact, I'm currently reading something else, which I will share later in totality, that talks about and keep in mind, in Latin America, you have completely almost segmented populations. So obviously, most of the Latin America had been at one point a colony of a European country. And there's these elite families that predominantly control, and most of them are from a mixture of European descendants. But you also have what we would refer to in America as the native Indians. They also have Indians throughout Latin America. I refer to them commonly as the indigenous population. That is not any different in Venezuela. They have European influence in Venezuela, but they also have large segments of indigenous people. Most of those indigenous people have been pushed out of mainland Venezuela along the river, which is also notorious for narco trafficking. And as I mentioned last night on the Alpha Warrior show, those indigenous people are subjected to all types of cruelty, both from their country, but they're exploited by the narco terrorists, the actual real bad guys. And most of them are from Colombia. And what they do is they kidnap these people's family members and then make the man of the family drive these fast boats with known drugs on them out to the open water to rendezvous with ships. And in some cases, if it's a big enough boat, they will go around to Trinidad and some of the other places. But they are not necessarily the bad guys. Some of these people are doing this to save their lives of family members. And so you can't just blatantly support the killing of people involved in these operations. And again, I have a big question mark of who's providing the intelligence for the operations. So we all just need to look at everything that's going on unemotionally and form our own judgments of what's going on. Do not allow the unchecked patriotic support of our military, and I'm one of our biggest supporters, but do not allow what has gotten us into this to perpetuate. We have always, as a country, supported our military. In the hindsight of intelligence that was purposely withheld from us, our military has done things that you and I do not agree with. So you can simultaneously support our military while questioning the government's use of our military. And that is not unpatriotic. That is something that a rational person should do every single day to hold their government accountable. And it is reasonable, given what we have learned that our government has done in the past, to ask questions. It does not make you unpatriotic. So, with that, I'm going to sign off and we will be back tomorrow. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.